Hello my dear doers, in today's video, we are going to continue our QWEB tutorials. For those who didn't watch my previous tutorial, I will leave the link in the description for you to check. In the previous tutorial, we already did some of the basics to moderate functionalities. Now, let's continue doing more advanced functionalities like caching, inheritance, and QWEB using JavaScript. To start with, let's start caching, and here we are going to use Tcash and tnocache directives. The Tcache method is used to make pages load faster since any QWEB T directives will be rendered only once and thus lessen any SQL queries. This is nice for the website to load faster. This doesn't mean the template will not fetch updated content since it will automatically re-render if the cache key has been changed. Say for example, in our model sale order, if we loop to each record using T for each, and we set this element to be cached by passing each model record, this element then will only render if I change this current record. By default, if you pass a record set, it will automatically use the model ID and the right date as the cache key. To try how this works, let's render the order name, order state, and order partner name. Before we try, let's first remove dev XML in PyCharm so that the cache will work. Upgrade the module, and go back and reload. Right now, all of this element has been cached. Go to the sale order module, select sale orders having the same partner name, open this partner, and just edit the name and save. Reload the page and check. As you can see, this part has been cached and will not re-render since the value we set in the cache is the sale order. Now going back to the sale order, if I edit this record and save it, at this point the right date has been changed. Go back and reload the page. As you can see, the sale order that I edited got re-rendered, leaving the other elements the same. In that case, if you also want to add the order partner ID in the cache value, then this element will re-render as well when the rest partner model has been changed. This has only basic elements but is beneficial to other model like blog posts, wherein the content is coming from the database. We can also use a boolean value in Tcache, wherein if it's a falsy value, the cache will be automatically invalidated. For example, for sales order count, we don't want to cache it for logged in users, but will be cached for public users. Go back, upgrade the module, and reload the page. Right now, we have 22 orders. Let's add one record. Go back and reload. The count has been updated. But for public users, reload the page. As you can see, it doesn't change. Lastly, you might want to just specify which element should not be cached inside an element with cache. To do that, we need first to cache the parent element, and inside this element, add tnocache directive to the sale order count. You can add any value as a reference if you want, or leave it blank. Go back and upgrade the module. Now, if we create a new sale order and reload the page, the sale order count will always re-render even for a public user. It is important to note that tnocache will only accept values coming from the controller render method. Say for example, if I add a template variable, either values coming from the controller or directly coming from the template, it will not be rendered inside an element with Tcache. In addition, Tcash Scope, which means setting values here, will not work outside the element with Tcache. Upgrade the module. Reload the page. As you can see, it's not working fine. What you can do, however, If you want to render any template variables, you need to add primitive values after the tnocache directive. Just make sure you add it with an element with an existing tnocache directive. In this way, you can now render it using a normaltout directive. Upgrade the module and reload the page. And now it's working fine. Next, let's move to inheritance. Since Python and JavaScript have different ways of creating a template, let's first do the Python inheritance. Create a new main template, having some alert content. This is the main template. There are two modes in template inheritance, either as an extension, wherein every change you make will affect the main template, or as a child template, wherein any changes you make will not affect the main template but will create a new version out of it. For extension inheritance, create a new template with ID main template inherited and inherit ID, which will be the template you want to inherit. Using XPath, you can target any elements present in the template using the expression attribute. If you want to start from the root element, just add the root element, which is div followed by slash, then the next element you want to select, and in this case, the h3 element. After selecting the target element, there are options where you want to render the element by adding a position attribute, which can either be inside, before, after, or attributes. For inside, let's add a new small element, adding new element inside title. For before, let's add a p element, adding new element before the title, as well as position after. In expression, we can also use a double slash so that it will search any h3 element in any nodes. It can be at the start, middle, or end. Let's then render this template to the page by calling first the main template and then the extension template. Before we start, let's bring back the dev XML to PyCharm configuration and restart Odoo. Go back and upgrade the module, reload the page, and there you go. We have successfully inherited the main template, and calling both these templates will render the same output. Now, if you want to create a child template so that it doesn't affect the main template, you just need to add a primary attribute that is equal to true. For this, let's target the div element and use the position attributes. We can add a class, remove a class, and add a separator. We can also set a new attribute and add some styles. Go back, upgrade the module, and reload the page. As you can see, we have successfully created a new child template without affecting the main template. Next, let's move on to the JavaScript part of QWEB. We will be doing several options on how to use it for a specific page. Under JS Templates file, let's start by creating a new template and name it QWebTutorials.js template with an alert and h3 element rendered from public widget. Then under static src folder, let's create a new file publicwidget.js. Let's declare that this is an Odoo module so that we can import Odoo modules using import syntax. In order to create a public widget, let's import public widget from web legacy js public widget and register a new public widget JS template by extending public widget.widget. Then pass an object parameter. The first property we need is the selector. The value will be any CSS selector from the page. So let's create a new div having class JS template. We don't need to use this class in the public widget. This is important since this will be the basis of this widget in order to be activated. To check that, let's have a console log under the start lifecycle method. Before we check, make sure you added all the files from static source folder using lab patterns under the assets property. Restart Odoo. Let's go back, activate the editor, activate debug mode with assets, check the console log, And yes, it's working fine. If you change the selector, go back and reload, this widget will not be activated. The good thing here is that it works automatically even for multiple elements. After defining the selector, the next thing is to render the QWEB template by simply adding a new property template with a value of the template name, which is QWEBtutorials.js template. In order to render this template, we need to call this.renderElement method under the start widget lifecycle method. Go back and reload, and now the template has been rendered. Now let's try to do data output, variables, and looping. Let's prepare first the template and name it as template with variables. Then inside this template, let's render a string, a JavaScript object, an array, model, and lastly, setting attributes. Then create a new public widget and the names will be similar to the name of the template. Selector as JS template with variables. For this, we are going to pass some data needed on the template. So we need to use render2element method from web core utils render. Under the start method, let's create a new constant variable content that is equal to this method render2element by passing the widget template followed by an object that will hold the values needed by the template. Let's add a string, array, and email for now. Go back to the template and render the string. For JavaScript object, let's try to set it directly from the template as someDate with value as newDate. Then render it usingtout someDate.toLocalString format. Then in array, let's use the t4each directive. This will be the same in the Python code except that we need to add tkey directive. Then use tout to render each item. For the attributes, let's add an anchor element and use the attf attribute followed by href. Add mail to and inject the email data using double curly brackets. And render the email using tout. Going back to the widget, the good thing about render2element method is that we can attach it to any selector. In this case, let's render it at the root element using this.target and use HTML method. Then pass this content variable holding the rendered template. Lastly, create a new div element having a class we define under the widget selector property. Go back and reload. We got an error. It's because we misspelled it. It should be with E. Go back and reload. And there you go. We have successfully rendered the template with variables to our page. Now let's render some models to our template. We need to use the ORM service. We then need to initialize it under the init method, but don't forget to add a super method in order to not break some code. By default, services are already available in the public widget by calling the bind service method and passing the service name. Just to note guys, this method is for version 17. If you want to implement this in version 16, you need to import public widget from web.public.widget. And when rendering it to an element, import QWEB from web.core and use the render method. When interacting with the backend, use the built-in _RPC method. So going back, let's add ORM in this example. Since the ORM service will return a promise, we need to add a sync_await to the start method, and then finally call the ORM service by using the searchRead method. Pass any model name like sale order, add an empty domain, and the name of the field we want to retrieve like the name field. Under the template, let's render it using t4each and render the name field using tout. Go back and reload. And yes, it's working fine. Alright, now let's move on to template inheritance. Let's create a new template and name it main template. Similar to the Python code templates, There are two methods in template inheritance, either extension or primary. Let's duplicate this element, but instead of name, change it to inherit. We can define the method by using tinheritMode directive, and by default, the mode will be primary if we didn't define it. Let's do first the extension, and this mode doesn't need to have a tname attribute. Inside this template, let's add an XPath, and the expression will be div element, and add a new button inside the target element. Let's duplicate it for the primary mode, and since this is primary, we need to add a tname and make it main template primary. This mode will create a child template where the changes you make will not affect the parent template. Let's then add a new button. To render it, let's create a new widget by duplicating this JS template widget. Let's rename it to main template as well as the template name. For the selector, rename it to JS template extension, and then create a new div with a class JS template extension. Let's also render the primary extension. Duplicate this element and rename the class to JS template primary. Going back to the widget, let's do another method using document.querySelector and pass this new class. After that, let's use inner HTML property to add some content and use the render-to-element method, passing the name of the template, which is main template primary. Oh, we forgot to change the mode to primary. Then finally, calling outer HTML property. There's also inner HTML property, however, this will not include the root element. Go back and reload. And yes, it's working fine. Let's move to subtemplate. Create a new template with name subtemplate, and inside, create a root element with an ID wrapper. Add a header, footer, and main. Inside main, render a subtemplate using tcall directive. Then create a new widget subtemplate. Rename the selector. Create a new div element with class JS subtemplate. Go back and reload. And there you go, the subtemplate was rendered successfully. Next, let's try to add some events to a template. Create a new template and name it template with events. Inside this template, create a span element that will hold the counter variable and a button that will increase the counter value. Then create a new widget that is the same as the name of the template. And for the selector, rename it to JS template with events. So in adding an events to widget, we need to define it under the events property. The value will be a list of key value pairs. The key will be a string where the first string is the name of the event like click, followed by the selector, like a button element or any class or ID. The value will be a string which is the name of the callback function. Let's name it onClick, and inside this method, let's increase the counter field class. We then need to add the init method and initialize this counter is equal to 0. Then we just need to target the element we want to render this counter using the find method having an ID as counter. Let's modify the text by the counter. Then add a new div with class JSTemplate with events. Go back and reload. The template is working fine. Click the button, and as you can see, the counter is increasing successfully. But let's check some issues here. If you inspect it under the Network tab and open the document, the preview will show you that all those JS templates will not be loaded immediately, but only when the assets have been downloaded successfully. So this might affect the SEO. To improve SEO, we need to transfer the template to Python QWEB templates so that it will be automatically rendered. You can also use the Tcash method to minimize SQL database queries. Then some other client action, you can pass it using the widget. In this case, let's add an ID better for SEO, and under the widget, let's duplicate this and rename the widget and selector. Now the idea here is to render initial content for SEO purposes. And once the assets have been loaded, you can then render other parts wherein you can apply all the methods discussed earlier. But I will leave that to you guys. Let's go back, reload, and if you inspect the document, we already have the initial content, and if you try to click the button, the functionality is still working fine. Alright guys, that's the end of this tutorial. For the final episode, let's discuss QM using old JavaScript framework. Please subscribe for more tutorials like this or hit the like button if you found this video interesting. Thank you and see you next time.